trampling down all carnal desires, we may enter upon a spiritual manner of living, of thinking and doing such things that are well pleasing unto thee. For you are the illumination of our souls and bodies, O Christ our God, and unto thee to ascribe all glory, together with your fathers from everlasting, and your holy and good and life-creating Spirit, now and ever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen. Okay, welcome everyone. Hopefully you can see me, not so important, but hear me. Tonight we begin our new catechesis lesson, or rather lessons, on the Ladder of Divine Ascent. Of course, it's important for us, especially many of us are part of the parish of St. John of the Ladder, but many of us didn't know about St. John until we came to this church. Although he's a famous saint in the Orthodox Church, we know him primarily from the book that he wrote, or rather the letters he wrote, titled The Ladder of Divine Ascent. So we are going to work through the 30 steps of the ladder, probably take us most of the year. If we have been covering basic topics or general topics for the last year or so, this goes a little bit more in depth to the spiritual life, to spiritual practice. It's not so easy, I have to admit. This so oftentimes the writing of the monastics, of the ascetics, is difficult because they rightly so require a lot from us. They expect the person reading is not wanting to straddle between life in this world and life in the angelic let's just say life that we are called to by Christ. He's expecting us to follow Christ wholeheartedly, give up everything for him. And so this is what the text of St. John tells us. But for tonight, we're not going to actually start reading the ladder. I'm going to try to give us a context of the monastery of St. Catherine, where St. John was the abbot, a little bit of the history of it, and some of the history of the spiritual tradition. And hopefully that will help you when we read the book to kind of get an understanding of the context in which John was writing. His text, of course, transcends the history of the monastery. We read it today just like as we would if it was written, recently. But I think it's still important to know the context. It just makes it so much more colorful and interesting. So I'm going to share the screen. And then if we have time, I'm also going to read a little bit from the diary of a pilgrim that went to Sinai in the year 350 AD, so really early times. Kind of during the time of the Nicene Council and all these things, we still had pilgrims. And she was a pilgrim from Spain, modern-day Spain, a Roman woman who wrote a diary. But we'll hopefully we'll get to her at the end of today. So let me begin. I'm going to share my entire screen because apparently it's a bit better for you guys to see the text. So if you do have a question, which you're allowed to ask at any time, rather ask the question with your microphone and not type it, because I won't see what you're typing to me. Okay. Okay, hopefully everyone can see. You can't just shout out. Okay, so the Ladder of Divine Ascent. This is the famous icon of the ladder. We won't talk about it today, but this was also, it's found in the collection of icons in the monastery of St. Catherine. So what is St. John of the Ladder was the abbot of a very special monastery, which is located in the Sinai Peninsula. Let me pull it up for you rather than the map. Okay, so this is a very important part of the world, especially when you read the Old Testament. The Sinai Peninsula straddles Africa and Egypt and Arabia, and it's this little kind of jutting out triangular piece of land mass. And then if you travel directly above Sinai, you get to what is now modern day Israel and the Holy Land. So you'll reach places like Beersheba is the lowest kind of settlement from that you read about the Bible that was part of kind of the Holy Land, going up to Jerusalem, etc. So this is kind of the central space, and of course we know this is the place where the Israelites wandered for 40 years. being tested and we could even say converted by God, so that their hearts would turn towards the Lord, having left Egypt, having crossed the Red Sea. And of course, the importance of this place really surrounds Mount Sinai, or the Holy Mountain, or the official name, the God-trodden mountain, which is where Moses received the law, and not only the Ten Commandments, but he conversed with God face to face. And God came and revealed himself in the cloud, basically. Revealed himself in the mystery. And this is a concrete place. This is a place that you can go visit. This is not just like a myth or something. And so Christians, after the time of Christ, were called to follow Christ, and part of identifying with Christ was to go into the desert with him. Just like he took the Israelites into the desert, he himself went into the desert to fast 40 days and 40 nights. So Christians went to live a solitary life, to be closer to God. And one of their chosen places was Sinai. We obviously know that there were many Christians who went into the desert of Jordan, across the Jordan rather. There's a desert kind of if you go eastward. And then also Egypt had many communities of monastics going out into the wilderness there. But there were the Sinite monastics. And, it must have begun very early. But they settled around Mount Sinai and also around Raithor, which is this area here on the coast. Okay. So let's just talk about Moses for a second. Now, Moses was an important figure, of course. Moses, if we read about the patriarchs before him, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they were nomadic Bedouins coming from, Abraham came from Mesopotamia. They landed up in Egypt, where they remained. But then we know the story, the Pharaoh of Egypt, forgotten, basically how the God of these people settling there saved them through Joseph, and began to oppress these people, the Hebrews. And God then raised up this great prophet, this great lawgiver, Moses, to free them from the slavery that they had come under. Now, part of their slavery was not just that they had been put into labor, but that the person ruling over them began to kind of set himself up as God, right? So he became a kind of like an image of the devil. The Pharaoh became an image of the devil, kind of setting himself as the highest authority. And so God through Moses, called the people out. Now, before God sent Moses to bring his people out and to confront Pharaoh, it's interesting, the true God, he sent Moses as his representative. But before he did that, Moses fled into Sinai, the Sinai deserts, after he killed the Egyptian. And it's there that he met a Midianite priest, Jethro. He met his daughter. He defended his daughter at the well. We know the story. And he married her. And he became a shepherd, basically, shepherding flocks in the desert of Sinai for his father-in-law, Jethro. He was a Midianite. Also, they were part of the Kenites tribe, which was kind of like a Bedouin tribe. And we know at that time that they worshiped Yahweh. And Moses was of the same faith, right? We know the Kenites fell into idolatry, and there was a mixture of, some of them worshipped various other deities, but Jethro, we can say, had remained faithful to the knowledge of the one true God. And Moses, in his wanderings, God came to him in this theophany at the burning bush. We know the story. There's an icon of this. He's removing his sandals. And God spoke to him through this paradox, this bush that was alive and whole, yet also burning. And God spoke to Moses through this, and this became the beginning of a new covenant. And God basically sending him out, revealing himself to him. So we can say that, of course, the Hebrews living in Egypt, many of them had a loose connection to the one true God. Many of them had already fallen into some kind of idolatry. And so what God is doing here, he's reestablishing the knowledge of himself, right? Moses says, "Who are you?" He says, "I am who I am." He is the God that is the being, the one who is being. And so the experience of Moses on Sinai is extremely important, and the burning bush itself. It's this God's revealing himself to Moses, strengthening him, and it became a very central point. And what's interesting is that Moses went, led the people in their great exodus outside of slavery into Egypt, into Sinai to go through their own personal journey now that he went through, and he led them to the mountain again, where God would give the law basically to the people and establish them again in a true covenant with a true God. They had forgotten him. They had fallen into various levels of idolatry, as we saw, what they did with the golden calf and all that. And so this is why Sinai becomes a very important place for our history as well as Christians. What can I say more? So this is the main reason why also Christians and monastics went and settled around this mountain, so that they could too identify and seek after the voice of God, seek after a direct experience with God in this sacred space. Okay. So it began with basically very brave. We have to give them a lot of credit. Christians heading to these places, following the prophets before them, totally letting go of the world. This is a totally otherworldly place. If you go to Sinai, just like if you went to, I don't know, the Namibian deserts, it starts to look like the moon. There's not a lot of growth, there's not a lot of water. The mountains are all rocky, and it's the opposite of the city. There's no security. There's you have nothing to distract you, and no crutches or no kind of things to make you think that you're self-sufficient, right? When you're living in the desert in isolation, you rely on God for everything. And you know that without him, you're in danger, you're in, great peril. I think that's why, if you meet like fishermen that go out to the sea and they've been through many storms and things, you don't find many atheist fishermen. The same like you don't find many atheist desert dwellers. The other thing is that the silence of the desert quietens a man's heart from various thoughts, and then you can actually start to hear God speaking to you, not like a voice, but in a inner whisperings, to the inner attention, the nous. And so these Christians would go. And we know that, by the 3rd century, there were little communities dotted around the Sinai Peninsula. And they gathered around the burning bush. Now, there was a bush that from very early on, people who were still living there attested to. This is the bush that Moses saw. And many anchorites gathered around this place and built their cells around it, which later would become the Monastery of St. Catherine. We'll speak about the burning bush but now. This this is a skeet. If you can really, sorry if you can't see the image. This is a tiny skeet. There's cells here. This is the skeet that Paisius lived on. I think this is one of the skeet of Galacticon. This is the ruins of the skeet of Saint Episteme, which you can still see today. I wanted to tell you the story about Saint Galacticon and Saint Episteme because they were actually a husband and wife who lived in the 3rd century, so the year 216 around. So Galacticon, let me tell you this story. Galacticon's parents, he's got a great name, by the way. His parents were pagans, and they weren't able to conceive a child. And a wandering Christian monk, which was more of a feature of society in the early Christian times, where these kind of wandering monks would go and kind of preach and give a word of oh, sorry, I'm getting a fine. Would you mind, man? Sorry, I parked in the wrong zone. And where was I now? Yes, so his parents were pagans, they weren't Christian, and they were met by a wandering monk who told them to pray to the one true God, and if they prayed to the one true God, they would conceive a child. And they did this, and they conceived Galacticon, who was then brought up as a Christian because they became Christians. And when he grew up, he wanted to dedicate his life as a monastic. But his parents were so, his parents wanted him to be married, and so he married a pagan woman, who then he brought to the Christian faith, who was Episteme. And when they came of kind of slightly older age, they both decided to enter into the monastic life. So they didn't start a family. And Episteme went and settled here in this skeet, and Galacticon settled here. So they settled in different kind of monasteries, which shows, this immense dedication in that early period. And what happened was there was a time of persecution. I forgot the emperor, and Galacticon was taken to trial, and he was killed, and Episteme came out of her isolation, and she was killed together with him. So they died as martyrs together. This is actually a miniature depicting that scene. So amazing story and amazing history that these early Christian saints, who were actually a married couple, became kind of part of the founding communities of monastics, both male and female, around Sinai. I just thought that's an interesting little story. And look how rugged the terrain is as well. Now, this is the skeet of Saint Galacticon. It's a different image here. But we do know that, and it's still functioning today. We do know one of the famous saints of our own time, Saint Paisios, lived there for 2 years. He came to live there, and here's actually, I think this is a photo of Paisios as a monk here in the skeet of Galacticon, if I'm not mistaken. And I have some words about that Saint Paisios said about living here, and I wanted to share them with you. Okay. So Saint Paisios lived here from 1962 to 1964. And people asked him what the life was like there in this hermitage. And this is what he said. The monk, wherever he goes, he goes through the same thing. God's providence does not abandon him. There in Sinai, God was always with me. When I went there, I had nothing. I found myself in the desert with strangers, without thinking about what to eat and how to live. The hermitage was abandoned and uninhabited. Water is scarce. I did not even know a handiwork to make my bread. The only tool I had was a pair of scissors, which I split into 2 pieces, and after sharpening it on a stone, I started making wood-carved icons. I worked long hours so I could live, but also help the Bedouins. So what Paisios was speaking about was when he went to this basically abandoned hermitage, he lived there, connected to Sinai, to St. Catherine's Monastery. He took a pair of scissors and basically broke them in half, and he made a carving tool, and he carved icons, and he would sell these to pilgrims coming to the thing to make a living. And the amazing thing is that I think you can even still see one of his carvings. He carved the Transfiguration, the scene of the Transfiguration. But he also used to use these carvings, the money he made from them, to help the Bedouins, who were the kind of Arab tribesmen who now live around the monastery. So I thought that was quite interesting. This is what else he says about the monastery. In Sinai, there in the hermitage of Saint Episteme, where I lived. So, he lived in Episteme, sorry, the abandoned one. The water was minimal. A drop ran from a rock into a cave about 20 meters away from the hermitage. I made a cistern and I was collecting 3 kilos of water 24 hours a day. When I went to get water, I put the can to fill and said the salutations to the Panagia. So he would pray while his little bucket was filling up. I just wet my forehead a little with my hand because that helped me, and the doctor told me to do it. I took some water to drink, and I collected a little in a tin for the birds and the mice of the hermitage. This water was also for washing clothes, etc. What joy, what gratitude I felt for this little water I had. Doxology, because I had water. That means like glory. So he was living on 3 liters of water a day. So he would collect 3 liters, basically would drip down in this cave, and he would use that per day, washing and everything, and even kept a little cup for the mice and the birds that would come to his hermitage. And then he compares that experience in Sinai being so like grateful for water. And he says, when I came to Mount Athos, I stayed for a while in the skeet of Iveron because the place is sunny there, and it had a lot of water. It had an overflowing cistern, and water was running outside. Oh, I washed both my legs and my head. But I had forgotten. In Sinai, my eyes were watering with gratitude for the little water, while in the skeet I had forgotten because of the abundance of water. And then he says, so then I went and stayed about 80 meters away, and I had a small cistern. And how we get lost, how we forget with abundance. So he even saw a little lesson in there that, and Athos, he had to move further away from the well so that he would appreciate the water more because it was so abundant compared to his time in Sinai. So for me, it's really fascinating that the monastery of Sinai, we have one of the great saints of our time who brings the patristic age to us. He had his moment in Sinai. So Sinai often becomes this kind of like connecting point. And we'll see that again in some other saints we'll talk about. Now let's go more to the history of the actual monastery of St. Catherine. The monastery of St. Catherine is at the foot of Mount Sinai. So the mountain in which Moses received the commandments, it is at the foot of this mountain, which is an important place because that's where the Israelites waited, right? While Moses went up the mount. And the oldest chapel that is still existing today was actually commissioned and built by Saint Helen. So she was the Augusta. And when she went to Jerusalem in 327 to found the Christian sites, some monks from Sinai were there. And they petitioned to her and said, please build a chapel there in Sinai. And she did this, and she sponsored. And this is the chapel. How interesting. It still exists today. It's the oldest chapel. It's called the Chapel of the Burning Bush because it was built right next to it. And this is the burning bush. So you see pilgrims there taking some little branches off the bush. But this is according to the tradition and this unbroken experience of pilgrims coming there. This is the bush that has continually regenerated itself from the time of Moses that he saw that was burning. And it's protected now in the monastery. It's within the boundaries of the monastery. And this was the sacred space that the early monks lived around. And so Helen built this chapel. But there was a great problem in this part of the world, very wild part of the world, is that the monks were often harassed by Bedouins, Saracens who would come. So these are not Muslims, Muslims to be, maybe, but these were wild kind of Bedouin people. In what's the Star Wars version of these guys?
The
sand people. It's like the sand people, if you want to have a sci-fi reference. They would come and often harass the monks and kill them. And there's actually famous events that took place where martyrs were killed, the 38 martyrs of Sinai. It's actually a celebration. We remember them still to this day in the church calendar. Because these monks were pretty much undefended. Most of the monks would live in skeets, which is basically they would have cells where they would live, and they would only gather on the Lord's Day on Sundays to pray, or on Saturday evening rather, to pray the vigil into the Sunday morning liturgy. So apart from that, they would live separate lives. And so they became easy targets. And so there were two monasteries that were attacked. I'll show you the images later. This is an icon commemorating the Sinai, the saints of Mount Sinai, and the different martyrdoms. So let me read about it. There were two occasions when the monks and hermits of Sinai and Raithu, remember Raithu is also the monastery on the coast, which is biblical Elim, the place with the 70 palm trees and the 12 wells were found by Moses. That's that place. The first took place in the 4th century when 40 fathers were killed at Mount Sinai, and 39 were slain at Raithu on the same day. Ammonius, an Egyptian monk, witnessed the murder of the 40 holy fathers at Sinai. He tells of how the Saracens attacked the monastery and would have killed them all if God had not intervened. A fire appeared on the summit of the peak and the whole mountain smoked, and the barbarians were terrified and fled, while the surviving monks thanked God for sparing them. That day, the Blemiers, which is an Arab tribe, killed 39 fathers at Raithu, on the shores of the Red Sea. Igumen Paul of Raithu exhorted his monks to endure their suffering with courage and a pure heart. And then the second massacre occurred nearly 100 years later and was also recorded by an eyewitness who miraculously escaped, Saint Nilus the Faster. So he's also a saint in the church. And he says, the Arabs permitted some of the monks to run for their lives, and they crossed the valley and climbed up the mountain. And from this vantage point, they saw the Bedouins kill the monks and ransack their cells. So this became a great problem for the monks who wanted to establish themselves and these places as sacred places of prayer that could also welcome pilgrims to come and experience the prayer life there. And so they petitioned, this was now already in the 6th century, they petitioned the Emperor Justinian. Just before I go ahead, these are the cells that still exist from the Raithu monastery. So Raithu still has a monastery to this day. Right on the coast in the harbor, there's a Greek Orthodox monastery there. It's not so big, but it is a continuous presence of monastic life there. But these are actually the cells of the original Raithu monastery. Very interesting. And this is a view of the Red Sea, basically, from one of the cells. I had some more photos of the old basilica and everything. They still have those photos. So this is Raithu. Okay. So they petitioned Justinian, who was the Christian emperor of this huge united empire. Now remember, Justinian managed to kind of re-establish the Roman Empire to its greatest extent, from Spain and North Africa all the way into Syria and beyond, and also Egypt. And so he had immense power and wealth and influence, and he basically he sent like a part of his army, which was a huge Roman army. He set up a station there on Mount Sinai around the burning bush, and he commissioned them to build walls around this monastery. And this is the monastery you see today in Mount Sinai, St. Catherine's Monastery. The walls and a lot of the structures that were built and renovated were built during the time of Justinian. And they built the basilica, which is dedicated to the Transfiguration. And there are inscriptions that commemorate the memory of Justinian and Theodora, his wife. And it also commemorates they mention that the departed Empress Theodora, so they can date the basically founding of the monastery to the year...
it's between 548 and 565.
Yeah, 565. Yeah. So this is still a very ancient monastery, even, dating back to the time of Justinian, although their previous chapels, like the Chapel of St. Helen, etc., built even before that. So here's a photo of the monastery as you see it today. These walls were built by Justinian's army. And the original monastery had no doors. There was no doors to get in. You had to get in through a pulley system. And that only changed quite recently, in like the last 150 years. So before that, you had to be pulleyed into the monastery. And that was basically the way in which they guaranteed safety, was that there was no weak point to get in. And then later on, they added a doorway. But basically, the way to get in was through a pulley system. And this is a later kind of type of icon depicting the monastery. So you see the monastery of St. Catherine here. Here's the guy with a little pulley. And various other monasteries that existed. This is Mount Sinai, and this is the Mount Catherine. So there's a particular mountain named after St. Catherine. We'll speak a little bit more about that. But you can see not much has changed. The monastery has remained pretty much as it was in the time of Justinian, at the foot of Mount Sinai here. You can see also the image of the monks going up the steps to the Holy Mountain. They often depict Moses receiving the commandments. So it's like kind of a collage of all the events that happened in this time at this place. Okay, so now we have the reason why this monastery was named after St. Catherine. Here's actually the chapel of St. Catherine on top of Mount Catherine, which is quite a far away from Mount Sinai, actually. So there's a story that goes that, and this is still attested to in the Orthodox Church, that the relics of St. Catherine were taken by angels, were carried by angels to the top of this mountain, and then later retrieved and kept there in the mountain as relics, and then later taken to the monastery, which was called the Monastery of Sinai, or St. Moses, or the Prophet Moses Monastery. It slowly became known as St. Catherine's because her relics were kept in the monastery sites. We know about St. Catherine. I'm sure St. Catherine was an extremely wise kind of philosopher, you could say, but a Christian philosopher, you want to say that, and she became a kind of witness of the Christian faith towards all the wise philosophers of Alexandria, and she put them to shame with her wisdom and her knowledge of the true faith. And she was ultimately, also she was very beautiful and educated, and she ultimately was put into martyrdom, and she became a great martyr of the Christian faith, probably the most famous saint of Alexandria. Her relics are still kept in St. Catherine's, of course. There's still a kind of a scent, a myrrh scent that emits from her grave. And so, this is her whole life is connected now to this monastery. And it's still kept called St. Catherine's. Okay. Now, this was slightly earlier. Now we get to the time of St. John of the Ladder. Now, St. John of the Ladder lived in the time of 579 to 649. So kind of like just after the consolidation of St. Catherine's, he became the abbot of this monastery, and we'll talk more about his life as we start reading the Ladder. But he was the leader of the monks at St. Catherine's. So many of the treasures that you can still see at the monastery were actually from the time of St. John. So the icons that I'll show you are kind of from that period, which is really interesting. So his life and his context in which he wrote this book, and it's interesting, the Ladder of Divine Ascent was written to the Abbot John of Raisu Monastery. So actually, that's in the kind of prologue of the book. It says, St. John asked Father John, the Abbot of Raisu, if I'm not mistaken, that was his name. He asked John Climacus, as we know, to give his monks some wisdom of how to attain the knowledge and the experience of God. And so, what an amazing gift! I mean, if we ask someone for advice or help, we might expect a WhatsApp or a short email. But John sat down and he basically poured his heart out into this kind of instruction book, if you want to say, of how to become participants in the divine nature. And this is what we're going to be reading about. So he was a man full of love for his fellow monks and fellow Christians, and this is his great gift, you could say. His gift that he attained through many years of struggle and prayer and tears and all sorts of trials and labors. And this is his labor of love that he gives to the church. So that's what we're going to discuss. But that's kind of, he's part of the kind of the flourishing of this monastery and this experience that the monks had. Let's keep on going a little bit of the history. I think it's interesting. So kind of after John, we have now the rise of the Islamic kind of expansion into the ancient Christian places like Egypt and Syria, etc. And so the Arab armies that are now united under Islam passed over Sinai, the peninsula of Sinai. And the monks actually sent a letter to Muhammad asking for, they sent a delegation from Sinai and requested a letter of protection from Muhammad. Now it's interesting that, let's not go too deep into this, but in early Islam, there seems to be a lot of ambiguity about what relationship Muslims would have with Christians. And you see it in the Quran itself. It's kind of got this double message. Sometimes it's, fight them and kill them. And then other times it's, they're people of the book, etc., etc. But we do know that Muhammad did grant protection. And he sent, there was a letter, I'll read the name. It had a specific, the Ahitiname, which is the Arabic word which comes from, means obligation. And it was a document that Muhammad gave to say, the monks of Mount Sinai are holy, beloved by God, and no one should lay a hand on them. And he signed it with his handprint because he was an unlettered man. And this is a copy of that. The original was sent to Constantinople. A sultan took it for safekeeping, but the monastery still holds basically copies of this letter from Muhammad. And it is basically the reason why for those next 14 centuries, the monastery has remained generally protected. There were some skirmishes, etc. But this letter is what provided them with the protection they needed and allowed specifically the Sinai monks to remain. So I find it really interesting, and it also is a very important document for scholars on the early Islamic teachings and those kind of things with these kind of documents. What else can we say? Let's look at the treasures of the monastery. Okay, these are also dated pretty much the time of St. John, maybe slightly after. But both of these icons, which are found in the collection of more than 2,000 icons in Sinai, come from the 7th century, so the year 600 and something, maybe slightly earlier. The famous icon of Christ the Pantocrator, and also the very famous icon of Saint Peter. These are both painted in wax, which was an ancient tradition of painting that predated egg tempera, which became the main medium in which iconographers painted up until today of icons. But this technique actually was very prevalent in Alexandria, even pre-Christian times, and it moved its way into the rest of the Hellenic world. And this is basically beeswax with pigment mixed within it, and that beeswax was mixed with gum arabic, which then would harden it. And it's very this is very how can I say, this material itself lasts very long, and the pigment remains suspended in it. And also the desert climate helped preserve these icons. So technically, this icon of Christ is the oldest clear, direct image of Christ that we have. We have frescoes, of course, of Christ in the catacombs from the 3rd, 4th century, but this is a clear icon, panel icon of Christ. And this one of Peter is really interesting because even at this early stage, the image of Peter was very much established in the church. This over a short white beard and short white hair, and you even see it in the epigraphy, the carvings in the catacombs. You can recognize Peter with the short kind of curly hair, and so this tradition of what Peter looked like is pretty much unbroken. There's pretty much no argument that that's what Peter looked like, and the early Christian witness understood that, and that's reflected in this image. What can I say about these icons? These icons survived the iconoclasm. So there was 150 years later on in church history, a period of about 150 years on and off, when the emperors of Constantinople decided that icons should not be venerated and should not be featured in print, and they burned, destroyed, etc. We spoke about this before. We won't go into those details, but most icons were destroyed at that time, and very few survived. But the icons in Sinai, because it was so isolated, they were protected. And so this gives us a glimpse to what icons looked like in that period, the pre-iconoclastic period. Very interesting. I mean, obviously very stylized, but the iconographers here were drawing from the Hellenic tradition, which was quite advanced in its portraiture, depicting like a strong likeness. This basically is the prototype that iconographers use for the face of Christ. So all icons kind of follow this image of Christ with this type of long beard, flowing hair, etc. And this is still housed in the monastery today, and you can go see it. And any of you who have visited the monastery, I'm sure you've seen this icon. But there's another treasure that they have, although some of it's been taken away, most of it actually, is the Codex Sinaiticus, which is basically one of the oldest surviving Bibles that is almost intact that we have today, is this codex. So it's not necessarily... Yes?
Just a quick question. Going back to that icon of St. Peter,
Yeah.
I saw there were 3 people above him. Do you know who they are?
I should have looked this up. So of course we have Christ in the center. This is quite a common tradition in iconography. We still have it in icons today, where it may be an icon dedicated to a number of saints, and then usually you have Christ in the center in what's called a desis, which means to worship, and then these other saints kind of relating to Christ. So Christ is the head. It could be Mary on the right. This looks like, I mean, maybe I've got a wingman here. Maybe Basil can look it up.
I will. I mean, I'm going to speculate. I mean, could it be John?
It could be John and Mary. Yeah. So generally, a young man. I was going to say it looks like it's John and Mary, just like the 2 who stood at the cross of Christ. This young male figure. It could be a number of people. It could be Saint George. It could be Saint Stephen. This is kind of the image that this is the kind of tradition. He looked like this. So I'll throw a few guesses there.
Like proto-martyrs.
Yeah, like proto-martyr Stephen or St. George or John and Mary and Christ. This is clearly Christ. We see the cross behind him, etc. So let's see. Basil will look it up if you don't mind.
Yeah. Okay.
But that's a very common tradition where you'll have kind of multiple saints depicted within the icon. You see what Peter's holding in his hand. He's holding a cross. Yes, he's holding a cross, like a staff in the shape of a cross. But what else is he holding? What can you guys guess?
A key for the
keys. Yeah, he's holding keys, right? That's the traditional depiction of Peter, right? He's the keys to the kingdom. He also has 2 pillars behind him, which, I mean, we can speculate on that as well. Okay, so let's continue. So the Codex Sinaiticus was written, or rather copied, in the year 350 AD. So it's a very old manuscript. We have it because it's not written on paper, it's written on vellum, which is kind of goat's, or rather kid, so young goat skin was scraped flat and smoothed off. And basically they were cut into squares, and the early scribes would write text on these, important text, because it was very expensive, you can imagine, leather pages basically. But what the amazing thing about these leather pages is that they didn't corrode so easily, and the scribes could write on it. And then if they made a mistake, you can actually scrape off the letter and rewrite it. Okay. So do you find out who it is?
Yeah, they're not sure.
Okay,
but they say possibly John.
So yeah, they're not sure. There's no inscription, so we're not sure for sure. But Probably John and Mary.
But the Mary, I think they're sure.
Mary, they're sure.
Christ and Mary, yes, but yeah, they're not sure about the other one, but possibly St. John.
Possibly St. John. Okay. So vellum is really interesting. I've actually done calligraphy on vellum to try it out, to feel it out, and it's really interesting. You can, if you have a scalpel, you can actually scrape off whatever you've put there to fix it. And this was good for scribes, not so good for people who are messing with the scriptures, I suppose, but it was good for scribes. If they made a mistake, they could fix it. And in fact, the Codex Sinaiticus has this. So there were certain revisions that you could see and this was all in the very early periods of this text, is that they would often correct bad copies, sections of it from the Old Testament and the New Testament. But basically, it's a really amazing text, and it's probably one of the most important Bibles we have, because it shows us what Christians were reading, what texts were available, and this pretty much has almost complete Old Testament, including the Deuterocanonical books. So that's also interesting, that Christians had these books that were originally from the Septuagint, translated from the Hebrew, and some were originally Greek. Yes, is there a question? Okay.
I found another source that says they say it's St. Menas.
Oh, okay.
Menas of Egypt.
So Basil's saying that icon, going back to the icon, that young figure is Saint Menas, which was
according to one source.
Yeah, which is an early martyr. So it's a young male martyr. Yeah, probably.
So, Father, can you hear me now?
Yes.
I was going to say, like, you said the Codex Sinaiticus has the Deuterocanon. Which one does it have? Does it have the Orthodox Deuterocanon or the Catholic Deuterocanon? The Roman Catholic Deuterocanon.
I had the list here. Oh, I've got a wingman now.
Yeah, I'll take it.
Basil's going to look it up.
Awesome.
I was looking at it, and it had Maccabees. It had. Let's take a look at what it has. It also had, in the New Testament, it had the Epistle of Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermas was included in the New Testament canon. Interesting.
Epistle of Barnabas and
the Shepherd of Hermas.
Oh.
And it's interesting, some early church fathers and writers like, I think, Clement of Rome, if I'm not mistaken, they do sometimes include the Shepherd of Hermas. That's one that was often included in the canon in the early church, and then later on it was not added because it was just outside of the apostolic age. Although there's nothing heretical about the text. It's written outside of what is classed as like the time of the apostles. But it's interesting that this very early manuscript still included that, and the consensus still in the Orthodox Church is that these texts, although they're not part of the canon, they are good for us to read. So we encourage to read them as well as like devotional readings. And the testimony of this is born in the Codex Sinaiticus. Now, what else can I say? I was looking up the comparison of this text of the Codex Sinaiticus with the Textus Receptus, which is the received text, which is basically the text in which most Bibles basically, how can I say, that were used from like the 7th century onwards had a kind of general consensus on. So the general consensus of the canon. And these Bibles were used constantly. And so we have many, many, many manuscripts and many, many parts of Bibles from the received text because they were used all over in every church and whatever. And so this is also the church, the text that the church uses, right? And the early translations, everything into English was the received text, which is the common biblical texts, okay? And so they compared those, because remember, those manuscripts are not ancient. So, for example, let's just say now they found the Codex Sinaiticus again. They rediscovered it in the library in 1844. So they took their Bibles that they had and they looked at the text and they compared it to this ancient text to see, do they match, or were the Christians messing with Scripture? And it's amazing to see. There's so many. They compare so many parts of the Old Testament and New Testament, and it really matches pretty much one word for word, which is amazing because it's gone through however many centuries of copying. Remember, this is not printing press, this is hand copied texts. Now, of course, there were some spelling errors and some certain grammatical changes and stuff like that, but these are seen as kind of minor scribe problems. There were some texts, though, we have to say, that were slightly different. So sometimes in some of the New Testament texts, for example, a certain event was omitted. They're not sure if that was specifically done because the manuscript they were copying from didn't have it, or they missed it out for whatever reason. But there are some parts of the New Testament and Old Testament that are either missing or have quite different wording as well. So it's a mixture. But the general consensus is this shows the reliability of the biblical texts.
So looking at the deuterocanonical books, they've got Tobit, they've got 1 Maccabees, 4 Maccabees, Wisdom of Solomon, Wisdom of Sirach. Yeah.
Pretty much what you can find in the Orthodox Study Bible.
Yeah, so I think there's some deuterocanonical ones it doesn't have, but it's a lot of the Old Testament is not there, and some stuff is in fragments. So not all the New Testament is there.
Yeah, so you've got to be careful as well because there's a couple of reasons. So some of the folios, so the pages, were missing, and we'll get to that a little bit about the history of this. But also, sometimes the scribes didn't have access to a particular book, and so they maybe didn't have that particular book because they just didn't have something to copy from. Because this codex was compiled through various, other previous texts that they then copied. But what's really interesting is that there's another ancient codex. So there's the Codex Alexandris or Alexandria, the Codex Vaticanus, and the Codex Sinaiticus. These are like early semi-complete texts of the Bible that we have today from that time, early 4th century or whatever. And there is a consensus that the Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus had a common source, had a common manuscript that they were using. And so they very much, which is an amazing thing because it means that there was already a body of scripture that was complete and whole, even in that very early period of like the 3rd century. So that's something to think about. But again, this Codex Sinaiticus does lend itself to the Orthodox use of the Septuagint, which this Old Testament was drawn from, and the books used within the Septuagint. Okay, so that's one of the great treasures of Sinai. The majority of the Codex Sinaiticus now is in the British Library, and you can actually go see it. It's in a beautiful glass case. You can actually see the open pages there. It's really amazing. I have been to see that. And some of it is in Russia, and some of it's in Germany, and the rest is in Sinai in the monastery. Okay.
I like in the Wikipedia page, it's got this bit that says Orthodox belief supporting reading. So they've got from 1 John chapter 5, verse 6, a Greek phrase that means through water and blood and spirit, which Bart Ehrman says this was a corrupt reading from a proto-Orthodox scribe, although this conclusion has not gained wide support. So, yeah, I don't know.
It's interesting. Look, I mean, we can go get into the text, but I mean, I just find it really fascinating how when you go back to these texts, and I mean, the thing is, the monastics who had these texts for hundreds of years, over 1,000 years, they had them accessible, these unbroken ancient biblical texts, and they were part of that living tradition. Just as they're praying in the church there at the burning bush, they were using the texts ultimately from these early manuscripts, and they remained Orthodox Christians. It's not like when they found this early Bible, they said, "Oh, the Bible is actually telling us to abandoned the corruption of the Orthodox Church, which is what maybe some like Protestants would say. So what the Orthodox are doing is later additions. The Orthodox Christians had the earliest Bible you could have, and they were still Orthodox all the way. So I think that's a good witness to that. Anyway, okay, let's keep on going. Now, there's some other treasures that we can find are in the saints of Mount Sinai that spread to the rest of the world. And one of this is Saint Gregory of Sinai. Now, Gregory of Sinai lived much later. He lived in the 14th century. And he was a monastic, I think he was originally from, I must be careful, I think it was Constantinople. But he basically lived in Sinai and drew from the living tradition of hesychasm from Sinai. And really, there's a lot of consensus saying that hesychasm, the Christian tradition of prayer of silence, really has its roots in Sinai. Because monks would go there and then they would spread it out. And St. Gregory actually brought hesychasm to the Slavs because he ended off his life in Mount Paroria. And this is actually the remnants of the cells. And this is the entrance to an underground kind of church. The monks were driven away, I think, by the Ottomans, but the people still go to pray there now in the area. And his whole, he wrote a lot of hymnography for the church. And when we sing, "It is truly me to bless thee, Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure and the mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond compared than the seraphim, without corruption you gave birth to God the Word, true Theotokos, we magnify you." That was written by St. Gregory of Sinai. And that's part of the hymnography of the church. But he was a great teacher of hesychasm, and he influenced a lot of the great saints, including the Metropolitan Cyprian of Kiev, who at that time was now spreading Christianity deeper and deeper into Russia. So St. Gregory of Sinai was an amazing saint, and he basically was exporting, you could say, the spiritual tradition of Sinai, which he was drawing from St. John of the Ladder and all those other great saints. So I thought that was just kind of interesting. Now, before we finish, I don't know what the time is now. Okay, it's just past 8. So I think it's a perfect time. I want to read to you a little bit from the diary of Saint Egeria or Etheria. She was a Hispano-Roman Christian, so this is before modern Spain, so it's what, Iberia or whatever. She went on a pilgrimage very early, quite an amazing thing. She was probably quite a wealthy lady, because she went on a 3-year pilgrimage, basically. Remember, there's ships, there's donkeys, there's horses, but there's no other transport. So this is mostly walking, actually. She probably sailed to Cyprus or somewhere, Caesarea, and then went on foot, basically, and donkey on this journey. But she wrote a diary as she journeyed. And she actually wrote to a circle of women at home. So she often refers to them like, "My ladies, I want to tell you about this and this and this." So it's also quite interesting just to see like this pious Christian woman is writing to possibly a female Christian community, like a monastic community, a proto-monastic type of community in Spain. And a lot of the knowledge we have of how Christians worshipped comes from her diary. Because she speaks about how Easter, Pascha was celebrated, and a lot of the traditions they still have today in Orthodoxy. So that's another great testament to how we worship in Orthodoxy is pretty much in line with what she says, which I think is amazing. I mean, she's from 381 to 384. This is like the Second Ecumenical Council, that early. And Christians are worshiping in this way that we can recognize. But she begins her diary with Sinai, although I think she traveled the other way around, where she went from Jerusalem down to Sinai. But she writes in her diary, beginning with Sinai. So I wanted to read from her diary. It might get a bit tedious, so I'll try to skip a bit, just to get a feel of what it was like for a pilgrim, a female pilgrim traveling at this time in this holy place of Sinai. Okay, so I'm gonna go to here we go. Okay, so this is the text translated into English. I'll I won't, I'll try to not read everything, but just please bear with me. I think it might be interesting. Okay. Where can I begin? Okay. In the meanwhile, we came on foot to a certain place where the mountains through which we were journeying opened and formed an infinitely great valley, quite flat and extraordinarily beautiful. And across the valley appeared Sinai, the holy mountain of God. And this place, where the mountains open out, lies next to the place where are the graves of lust. Now, on reaching that spot, the holy guides who were with us told us, saying, so these are the monks leading them through this place, the custom is that prayer should be made by those who arrive here. Then from this place, the mount of God is first seen. So when you first see the mountain of God, you pray, okay, as soon as you see it. And this we did. The whole distance from that place to the mount of God was about 4 miles across the aforesaid great valley. And for that valley is indeed very great, lying under the slope of the mount of God and measuring as far as we could judge by our sight, or as they told us, about 16 miles in length. But they called its breadth 4 miles. We had therefore to cross that valley in order to reach the mountain. Now this is the great and flat valley wherein the children of Israel waited during those days when holy Moses went up to the mount of the Lord and remained there 40 days and 40 nights. This, moreover, is the valley in which the calf was made, and the spot shown to this day, for a great stone stands fixed there on the very site. This also is the same valley at the head of which is the place where, while holy Moses was feeding his father-in-law's flocks, God spake to him twice out of the burning bush. And as our route was first to ascend the mount of God, which is in sight, because the ascent was easier by the way we were coming, and to descend to the head of the valley where the bush was, that being the easier descent. So we determined, having first seen all that we desired, to descend from the mount of God, so as to arrive at the place of the bush. So basically they're going up the one side of the mountain, and they journey down to the place of the bush where the early monastics were. Remember that the monastery finally built by Justinian was still 3 centuries away. So she was just going to the first kind of site of the monastics. Okay, let's continue. So let me get on it. And thence to return on the journey throughout the whole length of the valley, together with the men of God, who there showed us each place which is mentioned in the scriptures. And so it was done. Thus, going from that spot, we all prayed, and we arrived from Paran. Our route was to cross the middle of the head of that valley and to turn to the mount of God. Let me continue a little bit later. The ascent of Sinai. Then she says, we reached the mountain late on the Sabbath, so Saturday, and arriving at a certain monastery, the monks who dwelt there received us very kindly, showing us every kindness. There was also a church and a priest there, and we stayed there that night. And early on the Lord's Day, so on Sunday, together with the priest and the monks who dwelt there, we began to ascend the ascent of the mountains one by one. These mountains are ascended with infinite toil. You cannot go up gently by a spiral. So basically, it's straight up the mountain. Now remember this experience that the monks of Sinai, part of their devotional life was to ascend these mountains and to pray. And so you can imagine St. John, when he's asked to offer how we should approach our life, he immediately speaks of a ladder, an ascent. The spiritual life is an ascent. And the ladder of divine ascent is exactly that. It's an experience of Moses ascending a mountain. Because that's what the pilgrims, that's what the monks were experiencing as they lived in this region. Okay. So she says, you cannot go gently up by a spiral track, as we say snail shell wise, but you climb straight up the whole way, as if up a wall, and you must come straight down each mountain until you reach the very foot of the middle one, which is specially called Sinai. By this way then, at the bidding of Christ our God, and helped by the prayers of the holy men who accompanied us, we arrived at the 4th hour, so she also speaks in hours, the 4th hour, the 3rd hour, at the summit of Sinai, the holy mountain of God, where the law was given. That is, at the place where the glory of God descended on that day, when the mountain smoked. Thus the toil was great, for I had to go up on foot, and ascend being impossible in the saddle, and yet I did not feel the toil. on the side of the ascent. I say the toil because I realized that the desire which I had was being fulfilled at God's bidding. In that place there is now a church, not great in size, for the place itself, that is the summit of the mountain, is not very great. So there's a little church on top, and the church itself is great in grace. So she felt immense grace in the church up there. When therefore, at God's bidding, we had arrived at the summit, we reached the door of the church. Behold, the priest who was appointed to the church came from his cell and met us. A hale old man. What's that mean? Pale, maybe?
Hail.
Hale.
Hail and hearty. Like
Hearty.
healthy, I
Oh, a
suppose.
hale old man, a monk from early life, an ascetic, as they say here. In short, one worthy to be in that place. Another priest also met us, together with all the monks who dwelt on the mountain, that is not hindered by age or infirmity. No one, however, dwells on the very summit of the central mountain. There is nothing there except only the church and the cave where holy Moses was. So Mount Sinai, there was no one dwells there permanently. I think it was such a holy place, no one dwelt there. You only could ascend, pray, and descend. And it continues on about her experience. Now she goes on to speak about the burning bush. Let's read the short part about the bush. Okay. She says this: it was necessary for us to come out at the head of the valley because there were very many cells of holy men there, and the church in the place where the bush is. So this is what is to become St. Catherine's. Which same bush is alive to this day and throws out shoots, so having made the whole descent, throws out shoots. So having made the whole descent of the Mount of God, we arrived at the bush at the 10th hour. This is that bush which I mentioned above, out of which the Lord spake in the fire to Moses. And the same is situated at that spot at the head of the valley, where there are many cells in a church. There is a very pleasant garden in front of the church containing excellent and abundant water, and the bush itself is in this garden. And the spot is also shown hard by where holy Moses stood when God said to him, loose the latchet of thy shoe and thy rest. Now it was about the 10th hour and we had arrived at the place. And so as it was late, we could not make the oblation, so the offering, but prayer was made in the church and also at the bush in the garden. And the passage from the book of Moses was read according to custom. Then, as it was late, we took a meal with the holy men at the place in the garden before the bush. We stayed there also, and the next day, rising very early, we asked the priests that the oblation should be made there, which was done. Suppose it's speaking about the Eucharist, the oblation.
Oblation, like the
offering.
naphora.
Yeah, oblation is like offering. So the offering was made. So remember now, we're speaking about the early 4th century. And what I wanted you guys to get from this text, which I get from it, is how the experience, the Old Testament experience is a living experience. The monks are standing there at the side of the burning bush. They're showing where Moses loosed his sandals. Christians are coming there, offering Eucharist, after offering the Eucharist there, and there's priests that are dedicated there to serve the oblation, and there's monastics, just like we have in the Orthodox Church today. So it's this amazing continuation of the tradition. And when you go now to Mount Sinai, you find the monastery of St. Catherine, you find that same bush there. They're offering oblations, they're offering liturgy there, they're praying at the bush, the verse from when Moses was there. So you see this beautiful continued tradition, unbroken tradition, which I think Sinai has a very particular claim to. And I think that's really important when we start to read the Ladder of Divine Ascent, because the Ladder of Divine Ascent is a kind of condensation of biggest treasure, we could say, of Sinai, which is an experience, a ascent towards God, which Moses began, and Christians followed him. And it's this kind of journeying of man's will and God's goodwill towards us, coming down to the mountain, and every step is basically how do we draw closer to God, and how do we, more rightly saying, come to the, let's just say, it's revealed to us God's presence before us, just like the burning bush, right? God came to Moses. So this is the whole experience. And this is the treasure of Sinai. And the treasure for all Christians is this coming face to face with God, right? The official name is the God-trodden mountain of Sinai. And so we want our Christian life to be God-trodden as well. God to come to us and to us to have an internal ascent towards God, and God to meet us there on this spiritual mountain that we ascend. So that's all I have to say tonight about the context. And next week we'll begin the first step. So I've sent the text in our WhatsApp group. In the announcement section, there's actually a PDF document there if you would like to read the first step. That's our homework up until next Thursday. There will be some weeks in Lent and we won't be able to have talks, but please do read it if you can, and we'll discuss the idea, the goal of each of these steps. At least we'll try to summarize it. So are there any questions or comments that anyone would like to make? I'll stop sharing now. Still awake?
Hi, Father. So just a quick question regarding the burning bush itself.
Yes.
So obviously we've got a pretty firm idea of where they claim or what they claim the burning bush was.
Yeah.
You know of any controversies of people saying, okay, maybe this wasn't the actual bush, might have been relocated, something like that?
So actually, the bush, there are some stories of that it was relocated and replanted, but there also have been attempts for people to take part of the bush and replant it somewhere else, which has been unsuccessful. There's some, there's all sorts of things. Yes, there's something going around on YouTube now from like kind of pseudo archaeologists. Let me not name which church they're part of, but not the Orthodox Church, who basically claim that it's Mount Horeb is in Arabia. So where Moses received the commandments, and it's got like a blackened top, and it's like you're not allowed to go there in Arabia or something. And so there's like a conspiracy theory that that's the true mountain, and that the mountain of Mount Sinai is not the mountain. But I tend to believe the early Christians from the 2nd century that went to live there, because they were going there, probably meeting people that knew this is the mountain, within an unbroken tradition. I'll trust those people more than I would like 1980s pseudo archaeologists who just want to get lots of attention to and create a controversy. So the bush, to be honest, our faith is not in the bush that is there in Sinai, whether or not it is the bush that Moses stood before. But they don't say that it's the bush. They say it's constantly regenerated from that bush. That's the official stance. That is the descendant of the descendant of the descendant of the bush that was there. And that seems pretty credible to me, I suppose, that God would preserve that. But again, that's not the ultimate purpose of us, is to go gawk at the bush in Sinai.
It's not so much about the continuity of the material more than the continuity of the experience.
Yeah, exactly. The experience, you see, the bush helps pilgrims to bring it home, right? Same like venerating a relic of a saint. You realize that person is not just a mythological story. There he is. Same like that is the bush. Moses stood here. He had that experience. Lord, may I also have that experience. Maybe not necessarily with that exact bush, but maybe in my heart, or in whatever experience it may be. So this is one of the main reasons why the Orthodox Christians protect these sites, holy sites, so that we can enter into that experience with the aid of these actual physical things. But that's not the purpose, it's the experience, as Basil rightly said. So there's a lot of, I also read today that someone like more scientifically minded person said this particular bush emits a certain vapor that can catch a light.
Huh.
But that the vapor, it's like an essential oil type of thing in the heat. And that if there's some kind of a spark, that vapor ignites, but it burns out so quickly that the actual bush doesn't burn. It's just kind of like this flash of light. But those type of explanations, what I find, it creates a scientific explanation but it's not any less miraculous
Mm.
in a way, because like people also try to explain that the 10 plagues of Egypt, saying, you know, there was a volcanic something, and then there was sulfur in the water, and then the frogs came out. And okay, that gives a scientific explanation. And then there were locusts because whatever. But that all happened when Moses was there, you know, trying to tell Pharaoh to leave, that they must leave. So the fact that those events all lined up perfectly is pretty miraculous.
Yeah.
So those type of attempts I find like aren't that valuable. But yeah, I read that up today about that bush. I've never seen anything else like that. But yeah. Any other questions?
Father,
Yes, Christos.
yes, hi. Sorry, just a footnote. I mean, you mentioned just in part, in passing the Shepherd of Hermas in the Codex Sinaiticus. People wouldn't be aware of this, but I mean, there's a small kind of Cape Town contribution to that text in some ways, because back in the 1980s when I was a student, there was an older guy who did a doctorate on the manuscript tradition of the Shepherd of Hermas, and it remains to this day the most thorough, complete scientific analysis of all the family strands, which are from all the manuscripts that exist in the world of that text, including, of course, the one you mentioned. And it's just interesting that sort of University of Cape Town has kind of made the contribution to that. It hasn't been superseded. I mean, at our university, there's a word limit to your doctorate. Your thesis can be no more than 80,000 words, which normally works up to about 150 or 200 pages. This PhD was, I think, 952 pages.
Oh wow!
It's an incredible work. I've got a copy in our common room. I can always maybe just bring it to show you sometime at after church or something. Yeah,
that would be amazing. I think we should even take a look at the text of the Shepherd of Hermas.
Yes.
And see some of the early church fathers who commented on it. So yeah, really interesting. This is what really fascinates me about learning about the history of the church and learning about these places like Sinai, St. Catherine's, because of the climate, because of the isolation, have preserved so many things that really affirm a continuation of the Christian tradition, because it's like a time capsule. So that's amazing, and I'll be really interested to see that. I mean, I don't think I'll go through the 900 pages, but it'd be great to look at it. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. It's very technical as well.
Thank you, Chrysostomos. Very interesting. Any other comments or questions? Okay. If not, thank you everyone so much for your attention. Maybe one last thing I would want to add before we close up is that just like Saint Episteme and Galacticon, there was a male and female went into the deserts. Moses was he began his journey through a marriage, actually, to Jethro's daughter. So for all of us lay people as well. So this is a very monastic text we're gonna begin reading, but we must remember that it's been used by both men and women in the monastic tradition, but also in the lay tradition. So the Ladder of Divine Ascent was the most read book outside of the Bible for many centuries in the Christian world. And so we shouldn't be discouraged by the seriousness of this text, and sometimes it's quite austere calling, but because it's been answered to by both men and women, married and unmarried. So let's really enjoy the text over the next 30 weeks, I suppose, and probably more. And let us really try to follow John as our own abbot. He is really our abbot now, as at least the parishioners of St. John of the Ladder. So I hope that inspires you all. Have a blessed evening, and I'll see you next week. God bless.
Thank you, Father.
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 Thank you, Father.